President Trump has just dropped a sledgehammer on 22 countries around the world, but most notably Mexico and Canada. Canada in particular in a very tricky spot. We're going to explain. Also, huge news getting ready to break about Jerome Powell. Rumors abound in D.C. all morning that Jay Powell, too late Powell, will be resigning. We'll show you what we know and more stories as well from around the country. So President Trump dropping a hammer on almost 24 countries this week, sending personally signed letters to the heads of each of these countries with the new tariff rate they shall be paying. But most notable is the letters that were sent yesterday to Mexico and the EU and Canada the day before. Trump imposing 30% tariffs on Mexico and the EU and 35% on Canada. Canada in particular is in the most vulnerable of a spot. The letter, reading in part to Prime Minister Carney, this is funny. It is a great honor for me to send you this letter, Prime Minister Carney, and the fact that the U.S. has agreed to continue working with Canada despite Canada having financially retaliated against us. As you will recall, the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canada to deal with our nation's fentanyl crisis, which is caused in part by your failure to stop the drugs from pouring into our country. Instead of working with the U.S., you retaliated with your own tariffs. Starting August 1st, we will charge Canada a tariff of 35% on products sent into the U.S. separate from all the sectoral tariffs. Goods transshipped to evade this higher tariff will be subject to that same higher tariff. There will be no tariff, though, if Canada or companies within your country decide to build or manufacture product within the U.S. If, for any reason, you decide to raise your tariffs, then whatever the number you choose to raise them by will be added onto the 35% that we charge. This letter hitting the new Canadian government, the Carney government, like a bag of bricks. We'll explain why this is so significant in a minute. But first, watch Canada's response to this. Here's Carney's Minister of Industry, Melanie Joly. Watch her stress level here. There's a reason for this. Roll the tape.
We take good note of the comments made by the President. And of course, we'll let the Prime Minister continue his negotiations and will not negotiate in public. These has been the answers that I've been giving to every single question since the beginning of the negotiations. What I wanted to emphasize today is, as Minister in charge of industries and of the economy, is we are not alone in this world. We need to be closer to our allies. And that is why today is so important. It's been only 15 days that the Prime Minister signed an agreement with the EU to make sure that not only, of course, that we have free trade agreement, but that we are very closely aligned on defense and on all our industrial policies. And we're trying to make sure that ultimately, while the US is becoming weaker, we will become stronger and we will diversify and turn ourselves towards Europe. Usually would not necessarily be the case in a normal world, but we're not in normal times. And economic diplomacy is more important than ever. And that's why we need to make sure that while the US is closing its market and really taking its own path regarding protectionism, that we, as a stable and democratic country, continue to have open markets, including with the EU. And that's my job.
Now, the reason you're sensing the panic in Melanie's voice, the panic that's been felt for over 6 months now, even during the Trudeau government, is because Canada's GDP relies almost entirely, in huge majority, on exports to the United States. 77.2% of all the goods Canada exported in 2023 were sent where? To the U.S. They were purchased, imported by Americans. 77.2%, that is a huge number. Additionally, Canada's exports to the U.S. comprise over 20% of their total GDP. That is wild. If you own a business, right, and you have, let's say, 100 customers, but one of those customers makes up 80% of your revenues, that's what we're talking about here, a huge vulnerability. That doesn't include, by the way, all the jobs, businesses, industry that rely on these exports. Canada is in Trump's vice grip right now, and instead of just negotiating in good faith originally under Trudeau, they retaliated. Now, with Carney being elected, their new plan is to diversify, cut new trade deals with the EU in an attempt to replace the revenues they're about to lose, hoping the EU can pick up the losses for them. But here's the thing. All Trump's asking for is free trade. For 50 years, we didn't tariff Canada at all. Canada had full access to American markets. All Trump wants is the same treatment in return. Allow our farmers access to sell their products in Canada. That's it. That's all he wants. Canadian farmers can sell their dairy products into the U.S. with no tariff. Why can't our farmers sell to Canadians with no tariff? American farmers were excluded from selling to Canada without a 300% tariff. You can see it on this table. The highest tariffs imposed on the United States. Canada is number 2, 300% tariffs they charge for butter and cheese imports, which means U.S. farmers have been blocked from selling product into Canada. So why won't they just agree? It seems so cut and dry, so simple to solve this problem, right? Cut a fair trade deal. Open up Canada the same way we did here in the U.S. Allow real free trade. No special treatment, just Americans selling to Canadians and Canadians selling to Americans, etc., with no tariffs. What's so hard about that? Well, from what I understand, Canada's playing the long game here. They'd rather take the short-term pain and wait Trump out, hoping the next administration will just go back to business as usual. Apparently, if Canada were to agree to this tariff-free scenario, they're worried it could result in significant GDP loss. So that's the strategy. We shall see. In another story, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, is about to resign. That's what we're hearing. At least rumors in D.C. have been running rampant all morning about this. The Trump White House has been pushing for this behind the scenes for weeks. Powell has been resisting, but something apparently has changed. Late yesterday, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Bill Pulte, issued this statement saying, "I'm encouraged by reports that Jerome Powell is considering resigning. I think this will be the right decision for America and the economy will boom." Yesterday, the Office of Management and Budget opened an inquiry into Powell's tenure and stewardship at the Fed after OMB Director Ross Vought learned this week that Powell, he says, has been running the Fed like his own personal fiefdom, spending $2.5 billion in tax dollars to get this, build a new Fed headquarters in D.C., almost $700 million over budget. Mr. Vought going on CNBC last night or yesterday afternoon and saying this about Powell. Watch this.
The Fed has just mismanaged the institution, and we see that the extent to which they've been operating at losses for a number of years now is for the first time in their history. And then you just see a very practical example when you go to the nation's mall. You see the construction of this palace, in the words of one former official, upwards of $2.5 billion, massive cost overrun. And we want to make sure we have facts as to the largesse and the extent to which it's overrun, and the plans keep changing. The testimony that he has on the Hill keeps changing. And I think it just points to the fundamental mismanagement of the Fed under the chairman. The president is a builder. He's horrified by the notion of cost overruns. I go over to the Martin building not fairly often in my role as CFPB director, and you see this largesse. You see the artwork in the Martin building. You see the extent to which they just have built and built with no consequence and no conscience with regard to the taxpayer. And now it's overrun, and you get the sense that they're talking about the gardens on the terrace, the waterworks outside, the private VIP elevators. This is wrong.
And when you think about how the Fed's been run since Trump was inaugurated, consider this. To the run-up of the 2024 election, the Federal Reserve's FOMC cut rates 3 times by 75 basis points. They cut in September, November, then the last cut was in December of last year. Since then, though,